In the spring of 1870, the ice is breaking on the Clearwater in Idaho. Across the great forest heartland of North America, the snow melt is rising. The rivers are coming alive. And for some, as they wake up in the morning with a fresh cup of coffee, there's one thing that comes to mind: logs. Millions upon millions of logs. Workers dancing on top of them, defying death with every step. These men were called river pigs. They were also called river hogs, river rats, and caddy men. The nickname River Pig was not a flattering one. These men knew it, and they wore it anyway, the way men tend to wear their names, like a badge. To understand the river pig, you have to understand the world that created them. America in the mid to late 1800s was booming for lumber. Cities were exploding. Railroads were spreading like veins across the continent. Houses, factories, bridges, ships, all of it demanded wood in quantities that are almost impossible to comprehend today. Bangor, Maine, became the lumber capital of the world by 1830. It's also where Stephen King's home resides. Between 1830 and 1890, an estimated 9.7 trillion feet of timber passed through its port. The city's population nearly tripled in just 4 years, from 2,800 to 8,000 people between 1830 and 1834, all fueled by the timber trade. But here's the problem. The forests were remote. The trees were deep in the wilderness, miles from any sawmill. Railroads and logging roads hadn't yet reached most of these virgin stands. There was, however, something that nature had already provided: rivers. Pine logs floated, and rivers of the north ran fast and deep in the spring. For decades, the log drive led to sending timber downstream to the mills on the current itself. This was the only economical way to move timber at large scale, and so a dangerous, entirely extraordinary profession was born. The work didn't start at the river. It started months earlier, deep in the wilderness, in the bitter cold of autumn and winter. Every year, the cycle began the same way. In the fall, a small advance crew hiked far upstream into the forest, clearing a patch of ground, and built structures of a logging camp. Then, as winter locked in, the full crew arrived. Men worked in temperatures that plunged well below freezing, 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Their pay was as little as $7 to $10 a month in the 1850s. By later part of the century, the wages had improved somewhat, but never by much. For that wage, a man would sleep in a crowded, smoke-choked bunkhouse, eat whatever the camp cook put at the table, and give his body to the forest 6 days a week. They used axes and crosscut saws, trimmed off branches, and cut into sections roughly 16 feet long. Then oxen and horse teams hauled those massive trunks over ice-slicked skid roads to the riverbank, where they would stack in great mounds called rollways, sometimes 10 of thousands of logs deep, waiting for the spring. When the ice began to crack and the snow melt swelled, the rivers and rollways were broken loose, and the logs tumbled into the current. Then the water ride truly began. The river pig's first tool was his feet. He wore what were called cork boots, heavy leather work boots with rows of sharp metal spikes driven into the soles. Those spikes bit into the wet bark of the rolling log. Without them, a man stood no chance on the shifting and churning river of timber. His second tool was a long pole, 12 feet or more, tipped with a metal spike and a curved hook. This was the pike pole. With it, a river pig could jab a log, rotate it, pry it off a rock, steer it around a bend. In skilled hands, it was almost like a conductor's baton, directing the chaos of the drive. The river pigs divided into crews with distinct roles. The jam crew was the elite, most experienced and sure-footed men. stationed at the front of the drive where logs were most likely to snag and pile up. When a jam started forming, the jam crew rushed toward it. They leaped from log to log in the churning white water, reading the current, looking for a single key log whose removal might free the whole tangled mass. Behind them came the rear or sacking crewmen who walked the riverbanks, wading into shallowing, climbing over rocks, prodding logs free that had breached on the sandbars, wedged against fallen trees, or vanished into the brush along the edges. Observers watched these men who worked, described it as something like they were dancing almost. Contemporaries wrote that the river pigs seemed to waltz across the rolling logs, gliding from one timber to the next. Up close, it was something very different. It was ferocious, muscular concentration, the kind of balance that only comes from doing something so dangerous so often that the body itself stopped thinking and it becomes second nature. Nothing in life of a river pig was as feared or as frequent as a log jam. A single log catching on an underwater rock in the wrong spot at the wrong angle was all it took. The current kept pushing. More logs arrived. They piled against the first and then against each other. In a matter of hours, what began as one stuck log could grow into a tangled wall of timber stretching across the entire river, backing up millions of board feet of lumber from miles upstream. The famous jam in 1886 became one of the most dramatic examples the American logging history had. That log jam was estimated to stretch 7 miles long. The logs piled 30 feet or more above the normal water level. The immense pressure of the still flowing river against the wall of packed timber created forces that caused logs to snap and hurtle through the air like missiles. Breaking it apart required horse teams, scores of men, and steamboats. It took weeks to unjam that. But waiting weeks was not an option for them, and so they had to muscle through using pike poles, and it wasn't enough, so they had to eventually turn to dynamite. A specialist known as a powder monkey would be brought in, and the explosive experts who worked his way out over the unstable mass of logs placed his charge beneath the key log deep into the jam and lit the fuse. Then every man on that river ran. When the dynamite blew, the jam didn't slowly dissolve, it exploded. Tons of timber launched into the air and came crashing back down into the river, suddenly running wild again. Any man still on those logs where the jam broke, or if they didn't run fast enough, they were simply gone, crushed beneath the timber or swept under the churning mass, never to surface. One slip, that was the margin of potential loss. 1 foot placed wrong on a wet log, 1 moment of hesitation in the current, 1 second where a man's eyes went to the wrong place and he was in the water. Not just cold water, but a river choked with thousands of moving logs, each one a weapon. A man who went in among the logs was not likely to come out. He could be drowned outright, pulled under by the current and the weight of the timber above him. He could be struck by a rolling log and killed instantly. He could be crushed between a moving log and an immovable rock, and the water itself was a killer. Snowmelt-fed rivers in the spring ran so cold that a man who survived the initial fall could lose consciousness just from the hypothermia within minutes. Mortality was an accepted fact of this profession. Not a surprise, not a scandal, just the cost of the work. Contemporary accounts note bluntly that nobody was surprised when a river pig died, and that drive itself would not stop an account of it. The logs had to reach the mill. The season was short and the current didn't wait. Small wooden grave markers appeared along the riverbanks throughout the logging regions of the north. Some had names and many did not. In logging graveyards of Maine, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Idaho, entire rows of markers speak of men who died on the drive, often young, often far from home, often identified only by the company they worked for. When they weren't on the logs, The river pigs lived out of what was called a Wanigan, a commissary wagon, or sometimes a flat-bottomed boat that traveled alongside the drive where the riverbank roads allowed. The Wanigan carried tents, blankets, tools, and food that kept the crew alive. The Wanigan train, sometimes called the Marianne, was a caravan of wagons drawn by 4 to 6 horses, following along whatever path followed the river. It also served as a kind of camp store where men could buy tobacco, medicine, and basic clothing. Whatever they spent came back to them out of their wages. The men slept in tents along the riverbank in all weather. The drive season ran through the spring and into the early summer, which sounds mild enough on the calendar, but on the ground it meant sleeping in wet wool, rising before dawn, eating what the camp cook provided, and going back out into the water with sore hands, aching feet, and a body that never fully dried out. The spiked footwear that gave men their grip on the logs, they were brutal to wear on solid ground. Men walked miles in them every day. Their feet were perpetually wet, perpetually blistered, perpetually at risk of infection. The boots that kept a man alive on the river slowly destroyed his feet on land. The scale of these drives is staggering to think about. In Maine, 200 years of log driving left deep marks on every major river in the state. The Penobscot and more, millions of logs year after year. To control the flow, logging companies built structures along the rivers and flash dams, engineered barriers that could hold back water and then release it in a controlled surge to push logs downstream on demand. When jams couldn't be broken in any way, crews placed bundles of dynamite beneath them, blasting the Penobscot open with charges that echoed through the forest for miles. The environmental damage was profound. As logs traveled downstream, they shed their bark continuously, creating massive deposits of organic matter on the riverbeds. This distributed the oxygen and nitrogen balance in the water, choking fish populations and degrading water quality for generations. Rivers that had run clear for centuries turned dark and dead. At the end for the drive, the logs arrived at the sorting station, a massive floating barrier stretched across the river that caught the timber and funneled it into holding pens. Each log had been stamped with the timber mark for the company that cut it, marked it, and by law could not be altered or erased. Crews of men called scalers measured and tallied the logs, determining the board footage, sorting each piece to its rightful owner. It couldn't last forever, and this profession didn't. The railroads pushed deeper into the forest. Logging roads were cut, trucks arrived. By the early 20th century, it was faster and cheaper to move timber by land in most of the country than to drive it down a river. The profession of river pigs began to vanish the same way the old growth forest had, slowly at first and then all at once. In isolated pockets of the country, log drives continued well into the 20th century, particularly in the remote north, while roads still hadn't reached. But by the time environmental legislation arrived in the 1970s, the practice was almost nearly gone. Federal regulations finally banned most river-based logging in the United States, and the last major drives came to an end. The rivers, freed at last, began to heal. Within just a few years of the ban in Maine, the water quality in the rivers had been dead for generations began to recover. Fish returned, and the current ran clear again. The men who rode these logs are long gone. Most of them left no records, no photographs, no letters. Many of them are buried in unmarked graves along the rivers that have now returned to something like their original wildness. But the cities they built stand. The boards they floated to the mills became the floors and walls and ceilings of a nation growing at a pace the world had never seen. Every house framed in white pine, every railroad tie driven into the earth, every mill that roared to life on the banks of these rivers. All of it moved, at least in part, by men in spiked boots dancing across the moving river of wood. They called them river pigs. They were, without question, some of the most toughest and most skilled and least celebrated workers in American history. Everything we utilize, from the transportation to housing, has a history of people who labored for the future. Until next time, subscribe for more.